Hello, everyone. This is Matthew Petrusek, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and I am coming to you live from our studio in Rochester, Minnesota. Welcome to another seminar of Evangelization and Culture Live. It's our monthly live seminar where we come at you again live from our studios in Rochester, Minnesota, to talk about something that's happening in the culture that really deserves a deeper examination and ultimately an examination that will help us to become better evangelists. Today, we're going to be talking about Catholicism and democracy today and the next 3 days. I want to give a special welcome to all of our Word on Fire Institute members who are watching on the platform live right now. And for the first time, we're very excited about this. We're doing a dual live stream. So hello to all of you who are watching on YouTube right now. Now, the whole idea of these seminars is that they're interactive. So as our Institute members already know, please open the box at the bottom. You see looks like a little chat icon, little message icon. Open that up. Please say where you're watching from. We have viewers from all over the world. Please introduce yourself and start getting those comments and questions in there. If you're watching on YouTube, please also feel free to comment. At the end of today's presentation, the end of today's questions, I'm going to invite all of you who are watching on YouTube to join the Institute so you can have access to all of the offerings that we have. But please know today, and today only, you're able to put your comments and your questions in there, and we'll be getting to those in real time towards the end. So welcome to you all. Let's get started. Catholicism and Democracy, Day 1. What makes democracy possible? So democracy is on the ballot. Democracy is at stake. Democracy is under attack. This could be the end of democracy. These are just some of the ways that the term democracy has become highly politicized in recent years. And all of it, of course, sounds very, very alarming. But as is so often the case with political rhetoric, it's important to pause and ask some very, very basic and important questions. Namely, well, what is democracy? And what exactly are we called to defend? And why is it worth defending? This seminar, Catholicism and Democracy, we're going to seek to provide an answer to these fundamental questions. An answer in particular that shows how a Catholic worldview not only supports democracy, not only supports it, but in fact is essential to both A, the very existence of democracy, and B, the healthy functioning of democracy, especially when democratic societies go morally astray. In other words, we're going to see today, Day 2 and Day 3, and all of them together, that democracy has no greater friend than Catholicism, and when necessary, no tougher critic. So today we'll be examining the question, what makes democracy possible? More specifically, we'll be looking at what must be true both about human beings, about human nature, and about existence in its totality more broadly, in order for a democratic political order to exist in the first place. Tomorrow in Day 2 of the seminar, we'll be turning to examining the question, well, what makes a democracy good? It's one thing to say what makes it possible, but then we have to add on top of that, what makes it good? What's a healthy functioning democracy? Recognizing that not all democratic societies have equal moral validity. Now, the third day of the seminar will conclude by applying the principles from both Day 1, that's today, and Day 2 of the seminar to examine what does it mean to vote with a good conscience. And we'll also show how the Catholic social thought tradition provides an essential moral framework for evaluating democracy in action, giving us grounds to praise democratic outcomes when possible. That's oftentimes the case. And also to resist and reform those outcomes when necessary, which unfortunately is also frequently the case. But let's return to the foundational question we started with. What is democracy? What makes it possible? And why is it worth defending? You see, these are deceptively simple questions. Democracy, as we'll see, is indeed an exceptionally powerful tool for protecting human dignity and advancing the common good. However, it's also riddled with moral complexity. For example, if democracy means power to the people, what should we do when the people fundamentally disagree with each other? If the answer is, well, the majority wins, then what happens to the minority? What, if any, say do they or we have in the laws that govern them. At a deeper level, what is the relationship between majority support for a law and a law's morality? So, for example, substantial state majorities in the United States have now recently passed laws, this is post Roe versus Wade being overturned, that enshrine a right to abortion in their state constitutions. It's now part of their constitution that women have a right to get an abortion up through the very end of pregnancy. That's new. That wasn't the case prior to Roe versus Wade being overturned. So now this is a democratic outcome. The people have spoken in these states. Does the fact that most people supported these laws mean that abortion is in fact morally permissible? It's also important to recognize that at the definitional level, there are different kinds of democracies. There's direct democracy, in which voters directly choose their laws and leaders by popular vote. Then there is representative democracy in the parliamentary form, in which voters choose representatives who, in turn, both create the laws and implement them through the selection of an executive, the prime minister. And then there's the form of democracy we have in the US, the presidential representative democracy, in which voters choose both the representatives who create their laws and separately choose the president who will enact those laws. Different kinds of democracy. Within representative democracies themselves, there's also a diversity of relationships with both a national constitution, so we obviously have one here in the United States, but Great Britain does not, and national judicial bodies, like in our country, the Supreme Court and the whole federal court system and how that relates to the states and to national government in general. There's also the question of what defines a voter as a voter. Typically, for example, all voters are citizens in a country, but not all citizens are voters. And of course, what defines citizenship itself opens up many additional questions. You see, the point is that though the meaning and value of democracy may seem obvious, the reality is it's much more complex in both theory and practice. So, for this seminar, let's set aside the different types of democracy, of which there really are many, especially if we've got the Electoral College in the mix as well. Let's set all that aside and work with the concept in its most basic form. To that end, here's a simplified definition, a definition that we'll be using for all 3 days of the seminar. Drawing on the underlying Greek meaning of the term, demos in Greek means people, and kratos in Greek means rule. Democracy is a political system in which the power of civil governance is ultimately vested in the people of a country. The people defined as those who have the eligibility and the capacity to vote. So eligibility here refers to having the legal status to vote, typically referred to as being a citizen of a country. And capacity refers to having the rational wherewithal to vote, which at least in the United States includes, but is not necessarily limited to, being a legal adult, which here is 18 years of age or older to vote. So in sum, a democracy is a political system in which the power of civil governance is ultimately vested in a country's adult citizens. Once again, democracy is a political system in which the power of civil governance is ultimately vested in a country's adult citizens. So now that we have a basic definition of democracy on the table, we can move to the next fundamental question. Well, what makes democracy possible? What more specifically must be true about human beings and about reality more broadly in order for democracy to exist and function at all? To begin to answer that question, I'd like to turn to a quote from St. Pope John Paul II's 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus. In this encyclical, St. John Paul II writes, "Authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law on the basis of a correct view of the human person. Nowadays, there is a tendency to claim that agnosticism and skeptical relativism are the philosophy and the basic attitude which correspond to democratic forms of political life. Those who are convinced that they know the truth and firmly adhere to it are considered unreliable from a democratic point of view, since they do not accept that truth is determined by the majority or that is subject to variation according to different political trends." He continues, "It must be observed in this regard that if there is no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. He concludes, as history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. Now, what St. John Paul II makes clear here, and this insight will form the foundation of our own analysis of democracy, is that in order for democracy to be more than just a blunt tool for the enactment of majoritarian domination, the whole democratic system must be grounded in pre-democratic principles. That is, principles that exist prior to and out of the reach of the actual functioning and operation of any given democracy. We'll turn to identifying those pre-democratic principles in a moment, but first it's important to underline St. John Paul II's warning here. It's a very serious warning. Democracy, in and of itself, not only can lead to grave injustices, so there can be democratic outcomes that are in fact unjust, it can also lead to outright tyranny. In other words, democracy can produce tyranny. So put this differently, a democracy that is not built on the right kind of pre-democratic principles can, and indeed very likely will, lead to the extermination of democracy itself. So democracy can contain the seeds of its own destruction if it's not put together properly from the very get-go. Now, we can see why that's the case from an abstract conceptual perspective in a moment. We'll be diagramming a lot of this out. However, the historical record, it's just also completely clear on this point. So here's just a small list of some individuals who came to power within the last 100 years by a democratic process. So they were elected. Perhaps we can even say they were elected freely and fairly, but then transformed their democracies into a dictatorial rule while maintaining, for the most part, broad popular support. They include Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Daniel Ortega currently in Nicaragua. So Daniel Ortega is one of the worst persecutors of Christians on the planet right now, of Catholics in particular. And of course, the paradigmatic example of Adolf Hitler in pre-war Germany. So all these people were elected, and all of them transformed their democracies into tyrannies. So St. John Paul's warning, in short, is that democracy in and of itself does not guarantee a just political order. Certain principles must be in place prior to the democracy's formation and then respected within democracy's operation in order for it to be what he calls an authentic democracy. So what are these pre-democratic principles and why are they necessary for an authentic democracy to exist? So let's actually look at this quote. I'm going to circle two fundamental areas within it, and then we're going to expand on that for most of the rest of the conversation today. So Pope St. John Paul II writes, authentic democracy. So here he's making a distinction between any kind of democratic rule, right? Any kind of vote by the people, saying that in and of itself doesn't mean authentic democracy. So he's marking out the definition of authentic democracy. What does it entail? It entails the rule of law, but the rule of law in particular that's built upon a correct view of the human person. So what we're actually going to be looking at, we're going to call it anthropology. So a correct anthropology. And ultimate truth. A correct view of the human person and ultimate truth, which we are going to be identifying as a correct epistemology. Don't worry. We will be explaining and defining these terms in just a moment. These are the condition for the possibility of authentic democracy, which is another way of saying if we don't have the right view of the human person, if we don't get our anthropology right, and if we don't get our epistemology right, and it's based in some kind of ultimate conception of truth, we're not going to have a democracy. What are we going to end up with? A totalitarianism. And again, it's not like that's just like an abstract kind of possibility that may or may not happen. We've seen it happen in history. It can and certainly will happen again if these kinds of principles are not in place. So moving forward, we need to get a sense of why. Why are these principles so important? And why do we need them in order for democracy first to exist and then to function according to the right understanding of the human good, to function properly? To do that, I'm going to now map out a kind of diagram that I've used before. So those of you who've seen a previous seminar that I've done on the Word on Fire Institute platform will recognize some of this. In fact, in that seminar, which you can see, I think it was called Evangelizing in a Hyper-Political Culture. You can see this sort of diagram laid out in much more detail. So I'm only going to give the rough schematics of it here. For anyone interested, it's also laid out in great detail in this book, Evangelization and Ideology, How to Understand and Respond to the Political Culture, which I'll say more at the end of today. You can actually get for free if you're signing up for the Institute. I'm only going to give the schematics of it, but the purpose of the diagram that we're going to be working with, 2 diagrams, is to see that, look, ideas, say the idea that democracy exists and that democracy is good, it's not just some free-floating idea. It's, in fact, an idea that has a kind of substructure to it, and on that substructure itself is built on all different kinds of assumptions about the nature of the human person, the assumption about the nature of the human good, the assumptions about the existence of reality itself. And so what this map is intended to do is not at first to sort of tell us what the answer is, but rather to show that ideas not only have consequences, ideas have presuppositions. And in order to understand why any idea is worth taking seriously, we can't only look at the idea itself, we have to go deep down into the basement. So we're going to be taking that ride right now. All right. So the first way we're going to be looking at this diagram is through concentric circles, or circles within circles. And what I like to call this is thinking in circles. Thinking in circles. And the basic idea we're going to be laying out is that the smaller the circle, the more dependent it is on the larger circles beneath it. I'm going to be putting this in 2D for right now, but please go ahead and start thinking about it in 3D as well. So this will be a 2D model that we're laying out, but also sort of flip it on its side as we begin to put it together. Think of it as kind of like a conical structure, like a 3D cone, because we'll see that one idea necessarily depends on another idea, necessarily depends on another idea. So let's get started here. All right, we here in today's seminar are talking about politics. We're talking about politics, talking about not only the outcome of politics, what politics produces in terms of its laws. We are talking about that. We're also talking about like a methodological level, like what kinds of systems should we have to produce the kinds of outcomes we want at the political level. And we're talking in particular here about democracy. Okay. So what's the sort of the fundamental question we're asking in the political realm, especially as we're going to be applying it to democracy in particular? Well, it's something like this. How should we apply morality in law? There's a few things that I want to highlight here at this level. So we're talking about, in particular, law. We're talking about the kinds of injunctions, the kinds of systems and particular statutes that we're going to put into place, that if you violate them, there'll be some kind of consequence, right? Whether it's a fine or prison, or potentially even in some states, right? The death penalty still exists in parts of the United States, perhaps even your life itself. So we're limiting the construction at this level of the question of morality to say we're looking at morality, conceptions of good, bad, and right and wrong that actually have a coercive component to them. We have to do it. If we don't do it, there'll be some kind of legal consequence. I also want to highlight here the we. When we're talking about politics, we're not talking about I. We're not even talking about we in sort of a constrained sense, like our family. We're talking about a civil society. So all of us together within any given society, how should we all together apply morality into law? Okay. Now this, of course, is it's like an enormous question, right? There's 24 hours news networks, and now, of course, on X and all across social media that are just saturated with this basic question. And of course, it's a question not only about the laws themselves, but it's a question about candidates. It's a question about the means by which that we should produce those laws. All of that is packed into politics and democracy. This little circle has this dense content within it that we could spend, not certainly all the whole seminar, but you could spend your whole life sort of a political guru just operating in this space. Fine. The point I want to make here, however, is that in order to ask and answer this question, how should we apply morality into law, we actually have to ask a deeper, a more expansive question and answer it. The condition, and that's the condition for the possibility of being able to answer this question at all. And so we're going to draw another circle here. And we're going to call it applied morality. Applied morality. So where the question of politics and democracy is how should we apply morality in law, we move out a level of generality, or if we're thinking about this in 3D terms, we move down one level and we try to ask and answer this question right here. How should I or we apply morality? Now, on the surface, that may sound like I've just sort of repeated this, but there's some actually some what appear to be minor, but actually are very significant differences as we move to this greater level of abstraction. So note here that when we're in the realm of applied morality, all of a sudden the I here appears, because at the level of applied morality, we may not necessarily be talking about the collective, certainly not the civil collective, or we might not even be talking about the social collective or even your own family. We can be asking ourselves, like, how should I live my life? How should I make this decision or should I make that decision? Should I pursue this career or that career? Should I get out of bed today or should I not get out of the bed? Like, this be intensely personal, whereas politics is always about that we dimension. So the I gets introduced here. And also notice here that we're not necessarily talking about law at this level. So law is sort of a subset. It's an application of applied morality to a more specific level. Here we're talking about how do we apply good and bad and right and wrong, and that may or may not actually play out into law. I think a very illustrative example of this is, think of the question of adultery, right? Cheating. So that's like, if there's one thing that can like destroy families, and destroying family, one thing in addition to addiction, it's adultery, right? It just totally devastates families. And as you devastate families, like you break up the very foundation of society itself and all the consequences that come out of that, right? So adultery is like, it's a really bad thing. But no, adultery actually isn't illegal. In I can't think of any democracy where it's illegal. So here we're actually making a separation between something that's really, really bad, but for some specific reasons that we could investigate at a later time, has been determined that it shouldn't be a crime to do it. So of course, the area of applied morality is also absolutely enormous, and it's like it's super practical. So and some of this may sound abstract, but we always want to bring it down to the most concrete level. We're asking the question of applied morality. We're saying, like, what should I do? How should I structure my time? What should I pursue or not pursue in the minutia and the big movements of my life, of our life together? Huge question. We could spend our whole life on it. But note here, it's applied, right? It's in the very category of the circle itself. So the point is, like, okay, if we're going to have the conversation, if we're going to be able to ask and answer the question, how should I apply morality? We actually have to ask and answer an even more basic question. And so we're going to have to draw another rung on our thinking in circles maps. And that is going to be the circle of morality itself. Not applied morality, but morality. And the basic question we're asking about morality is, what is good and evil, and what is right and wrong. Now, if you spend enough time studying ethics, and some of you may know this who have studied ethics or studied philosophy, that good and evil tends to describe one theory or one kind of set of theories of morality, and right and wrong tends to describe a whole nother set of theories about morality. We're not going to worry about that here. We'll just sort of jumble them all together. The basic idea is we need a general theory for what identifies what's good and what identifies what's bad. So let me just pause here. We're going a little bit more detail on that in just a second, but sort of the journey that we've already been through. So the basic idea is like, okay, we're talking about politics, we're talking about democracy. How should we apply morality in law? Well, in order to really answer that question, we have to know how we should apply morality in general, the subset of which we would then apply specifically to the category of law. But in order to ask and answer that question, we'd have to actually ask and answer this question here. Well, what is good and evil and right and wrong? It's sort of the most basic sense. Like, what's our general theory of morality? Now, we're going to look in just a little bit of what happens if someone says, well, look, you don't even need a general theory of morality. In fact, politics is ultimately just about preferences, and preferences are amoral, and it's just ultimately a power game. We'll see what happens if you actually take that road. That's precisely what St. Pope John Paul II is worried about and trying to get us to avoid. So let's set that aside for a moment and just say, look, we need some kind of conception of morality. It gets a little more complex than that too, right? The idea is that, okay, I'm going to ask and answer this question, both for myself and for, say, society more broadly. This is what I think is good. This is what I think is bad. And then I'm going to say, all right, then how do I apply it, right? How do I move to that more specific level of application? So let me represent that here with a kind of, I know this is getting a little messy, but this is the real deal. This is the Institute Live. This is a real classroom, right? So we're gonna play it raw here. All right. So this pyramid here represents taking a general principle and seeking to apply it to a particular kind of circumstance or situation. Let's say someone's asking me, all right, I want you to summarize sort of your basic moral theory. Tell me in the most sort of generic sense what you most think is most important, like how you live your life morally. Let's say I say something like, sounds like an easy one, you know what, something like the golden rule. So in all the decisions that I make, my morality is that I want to treat people how I would want to be treated if I were in that situation. And so that's how I'm going to make my decisions about both the little things and the big things in my life, is sort of this kind of empathy, perhaps. It's an empathetic kind of approach to morality. Sounds pretty good. So then I'd say, well, what is good and bad and right and wrong? What's good is treating people as you would want to be treated in their circumstance. I'm going to apply that and generally, and then I'm going to try and somehow make that into law. Well, here's an issue with that. Let's say that you are a police officer and you are out on patrol at night and a car just whizzes by you going 100 miles an hour, swerving, and you pull them over. And as you get out of the car and approach it, the window goes down and a huge plume of smoke comes out, not cigarette smoke, right? You can smell the marijuana. And as you peer into the car to see the driver, you see these just bloodshot red eyes, and there's in the passenger seat, it's just filled with empty bottles of booze. Okay. So now you're like, all right, I have to make a decision here. I watched this Evangelization and Cultural Live seminar, and I realized that I have to take abstract moral principles and apply them in a particular situation. What's my abstract moral principle? Oh, every time I have to make a moral decision, I'm going to do what I would want done if I were the person in that situation. Well, you can already see the problem, right? So if a police officer, or it could be a judge, or we can think of all the different other roles that we have to play in life, acts according to that principle, you'd actually be legally liable. You'd be doing an act of evil by letting somebody who's drunk, who obviously doesn't want to be arrested, to just drive back off into the night. So the point is just because we can identify a general moral principle doesn't in and of itself mean that it's easy and obvious how to get there. Okay, so that's complex. Right? We are already deep into complexity here in order to really even have anything to say about politics and democracy, but it gets more complex. Why? Because in order to ask and answer this question here, what is good and evil and right and wrong, we actually have to go deeper, wider, into a even more complex and expansive area. And that's called epistemology, a word that I already used when we looked at St. John Paul II's quote. So epistemology, it's one of those fancy words, right? And there is a danger when you're in an academic environment that the professor or the teacher is going to use a word in order to try and kick up dust to confuse you, and then you just give them the benefit of the doubt. Oh, that must be really important because I can't understand it. Therefore, it's got to be like this guy's really got to be smart. That's a danger in the classroom. It's a big danger. Sometimes, however, the big word is helpful, and I think that's the case here. So epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme, which means like a whole system of knowledge. It's not about knowing this thing or that thing, but like, how do we put all the different forms of knowing together into one coherent whole? And then ology would be the study of that. So it's the study of knowing itself. And the basic question that it's seeking to ask and answer is this. How do we know anything at all? Now, again, brief pause here. Okay, so like I thought I was watching a seminar about democracy, and we're going to be talking about the election or something like that. Nah, look where we have to go in very short order. How should I apply morality in the law? Well, I need to know what it is to apply morality at all. Well, how do I do that? Well, I have to have some conception of good and evil and right and wrong in order to apply it. But how do I get a conception of good and evil and right and wrong? Well, I have to know it. Well, how do I know what I know? Now, again, that question, we can ask the sort of the specific question, how do I know anything that's good, bad, and right and wrong, specifically? But that's a subset of the broader question of like, how do I know anything at all? Why is any form of knowledge, any piece of knowledge, or any methodology I use to know something, why there should be any reason to believe that I'm actually not just making it up, right? That I'm grasping onto something. We'll get more to this in a moment. We look at different theories of truth. But I just want to emphasize here that we have to answer this question in order to answer these other questions. And in fact, I'm going to star this because we're going to come back to it, because epistemology, even though it's not like the widest rung, it's not the foundation of everything, in a sense, it's the most important one. And we'll come back to that. All right. Now, I wish I could tell you we're done. We can go back to our regular scheduled discussion of democracy, but we're not done. Because in order to ask and answer like this question here, how do we know anything at all? We have to go deeper. We have to go wider. And we have to go to, in particular, another word that I already also used, and that's anthropology. So anthropology, ology, study of, anthros, human beings. We have to ask and answer this basic question here. What is a we or an I? So notice here in the epistemology question, I asked, how do we, I could also put I here as well. How do we, or how do I know anything at all? So we're asking about knowledge. Well, in order for me to ask and answer that question of like how it's possible to know anything, I would have to first say, well, what's the nature of the knower, right? What's the nature collectively of us as knowers, or as me as a knower? In other words, we have to have a theory of human nature. A theory of human nature that can explain, for example, are we rational creatures? Are we creatures just driven by our desires? Are we creatures that are capable of actually apprehending abstract truths in the first place? Are we creatures that just sort of make it up as we go? We have to get into anthropological theories, right? And the idea is if we don't answer that question, if we don't say what a we or an I is, then we can't say what those we's or I's can know. And if we can't know how we know, then we can't say anything about how we know good and evil and right and wrong. We can't say that. We can't say anything about how we apply it. We can't say anything how we apply it. We certainly are we're just making it up at the level of politics. We're getting close to being done, but we're not quite there. Because in order to ask and answer this question, what is a we or an I, we actually have to get even broader. These circles are getting messy, but you'll get the idea. And that's what's called ontology. Another fancy word, but a helpful one. Ology, study of, ontos, being. Here we're abstracting from the question, what's the nature of a human being, to asking what the nature of being itself is. So one way we could put that is to say, just what is? So here we're asking specifically, what is a we or an I, or what is a human being? Here we're more broadly asking, what is? You say, well, why do we need to ask and answer that? The reason is because if I don't know what the nature of isness is, or the nature of existence per se is, then I can't talk about any subset of that in particular, including human beings, because I need to have an answer to this first, right? If I get this wrong, then I'm gonna get everything else wrong as well. In particular, I have to know in a basic sense, like, is existence broadly, is it like ordered instruction and meaningful and purposeful, or is it just completely arbitrary? So how we answer that question is going to give us very different kinds of politics, as we'll see in just a moment. So we have to have an ontology. Another word we could use here is we have to have a metaphysics. If we don't, we can't answer any of these questions. Last rung. Now, some might say, well, this is sufficient, right? This is the deepest you can possibly go in examining a kind of an idea. It's down to the metaphysical level. But there's actually one level deeper we can go, and that is the theological level here. I'm out of space here. We're going to squeeze it in. We'll put theology. So theology would be the study of what? The study of God. We could abstract a little bit more and say it's the study of the question of God. And here we're asking like this basic question. So I'll draw an arrow over here. It's what makes anything possible at all? And here, so we're abstracting even beyond, we're taking it to the level of metaphysics, taking it to the highest level of ontology, to asking what's the condition for the possibility of existence at all, which is ultimately a theological question. So the whole reason for this exercise, and I'm going to show you, and I'll do it much more briefly in just a moment, I'll show you a sort of a different model of conceiving of this with the same information, is to show that in order to ask and answer the question of politics, we have to be doing all of this at the same time, right? We have to be able to give an account not only of the particular ideas we're dealing with, but the whole substructure. Another reason that's important is because whatever we claim at this level, at these sort of outer layers, is definitely going to affect what we claim at the inner levels. Likewise, whatever we say at these inner levels are going to imply greater truths. So for example, this is jumping ahead just a little bit. Like if I say, for example, that we can know that all human beings are equal at this epistemological level, that all human beings are morally equal, well, that necessarily implies what? At the anthropological level, we must somehow actually be equal in some respect, right? So the knowledge would presuppose the actual existence of equality. So when we're looking in, out, it implies, but also when we're looking outside in, the idea is like what we say out here is going to definitely, in fact, determine, not just have an influence on, but determine what here. We have a very brief example. So let's say at this sort of theological level right here, I say, okay, you know what? What's my theology? My theology is something, I read Nietzsche in college, and I thought it was like, wow, it blew my mind. God is dead. So God is dead. All right. No God. The whole idea of God has been destroyed by modern man. And so we're now in a godless universe. Okay, so God is dead. That's our data point here at the theological level. God is dead. Well, if God is dead, what is nothing, right? That's the answer to this question. Or what makes anything possible at all? Nothing. So then we ask, okay, well, what does that mean for our metaphysics or our ontology? What is? Well, if there's no God, right? There's no being. There's no condition for the possibility of being. It's just complete emptiness, which is impossible to conceive. But let's play along. What is? Nothing is. Okay, so like it's all arbitrary and random. Okay, well, what does that mean for what is a we or an I? The we or an I. What is a human being? Also a nothing. Right? There's no order, structure, meaning, or purpose to the universe. There's not going to be any order, structure, meaning, or purpose to the I. Okay, well, what does that mean for epistemology? That means that the only thing we could possibly know about anything at all is that it's a big fat nothing, right? There's nothing else to say beyond the fact that it's a nothing. What does that mean for our conception of morality? Well, there is no morality. In fact, Nietzsche wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil. Those are false categories. They don't pertain to anything real. What does that mean for applied morality? How should I live my life? Like however you want to, and even, given that you even know that what you want to do in this sort of purposeless universe, it would just be what Nietzsche calls a will to power. Okay, so what kind of politics do you think we're going to get out of that, right? You're not going to get a democracy. You're not going to get a constitutional democracy that's obsessed with human rights. Okay, so you see, whatever you claim out here is massively going to influence here, just as whatever you claim here is going to presuppose other ideas here. All right. That's, again, a much more developed version of this is in an earlier seminar that you can access on the Institute platform. Another way that we can conceive of this, and then we'll jump right back into our discussion of democracy itself, is to say, okay, we can, instead of thinking of it as circles, we can kind of think of it as a pyramid, a 3D pyramid, which I have a pretty highly developed sense of shame, so I'm not going to try and draw 3D anything here, but this this is a pyramid. It's pyramid inspired, and we can look at the same information, the same relationship of ideas here. So, at the base of this pyramid, we would put theology. Above that, we would put ontology. Above that, we would put anthropology. Above that, we would put epistemology. Above that, we would put morality. Above that, we put applied morality. And above that, we would put the question of politics. And above that, we could actually put democracy here, because not all politics is democracy, but all democracy is a form of politics. Right, now, before I told you that, I wanted to highlight epistemology in particular. Why? Because, so on the one hand, like, in order to have any theory of knowing, you have to have a human being. Right? That's the condition for the possibility of asking what can humans know, is that humans exist. And so in that sense, like, epistemology is here in the center, right? These anthropology, ontology, theology are below it, right? They hold up epistemology. On the other hand, however, how we answer every question, so how we answer the question, what is democracy good? How we answer the question of what is politics, how we answer the question of applied morality, but also how we answer the question of anthropology, ontology, and theology. It all depends on the epistemology that we assume, right? That we embrace. So, for example, if I embrace an epistemology that's a kind of based on a radical empiricism, like we can only know what our senses tell us, that's the only thing we can know, we're going to get very different kinds of answers to all of these questions than if we embrace a epistemology that says, well, no, we can actually know abstract truths that aren't necessarily empirical. Or we could say, in fact, we can know abstract truths that make the empirical possible. We're going to get very different answers here. Likewise, if say at the epistemological level, if I say I'm only an empiricist, I can only tell you what my senses tell me. I'm a scientist, right? Radical scientist. Well, then you're not going to be able to say, and I believe in human moral equality for two reasons. One, because empiricism can't see morality. And two, empiricism can't see moral equality among human beings. It doesn't exist at an empirical level. So in a sense, this is really key here. We'll see why that's so important as we move back into the thought of St. John Paul II. So let's go there. Let's go there. Now that we have a sort of sense of why all this is so important, we can move back to St. John Paul II himself, his critique of democracy, or not his critique of democracy, his warning about the conditions for authentic democracy. So remember that what St. John Paul II was saying is crucial, is getting this right here, right? We have to have an ultimate sense of truth, an objective sense of truth, and getting this right here. We have to have an accurate understanding of who the person is. So first of all, let me focus on this claim about why truth is so important for him, why getting the right epistemology is so important. Okay, well, at the risk of really simplifying things, we're going to identify three basic theories of truth. One of them is what we can call so we'll put theories of truth. What we'll call pragmatism. Another is what we could call subjectivism or cultural relativism. And the third we can call, well, the technical term is the correspondence theory of truth. But we'll just call it objective truth. An objective theory of truth. All right. So what are these things? Well, pragmatism is basically the idea, and this is a very attractive idea to many people. It's very like enticing, even for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about these things. It's like, look, the question of truth, pretty hard. You can get a PhD in epistemology, right? And then spend your whole life like arguing about it. So how in the world, if that's the case, are we ever going to be able to settle the question of truth at some deep metaphysical level in such a way that we'd be able to use it at the political level? So what we're looking for here is the kind of solution to that basic problem here. Let's set aside, this is pragmatism speaking, let's set aside like all the complex questions we could possibly ask about truth and just focus on what we need in order to live together as a people in peace. I told you, it sounds like really appealing, right? Just focus on utility, focus on usefulness. That's pragmatism. Subjectivism or cultural relativism is also very attractive in its own right. So subjectivism is basically the idea that I create my own truth and you create your truth. This is sort of taken mantra status in our contemporary culture is you do you and I do me, or this is my truth, but you can have your truth, right? I have to live out my truth. You hear these kinds of things just sort of uttered as if it's just clearly the case. Okay. Well, that seems to be attractive. One, because hey, I get to be my own God. But apart from that, it's like, well, look, people really do disagree with each other in some pretty deep ways. So why don't we just recognize that everybody kind of creates their own truth world? And we're all talking here at this epistemological level. Everybody creates their own truth world, and we'll just to each his own, right? Okay, fine. Cultural relativism is similar to subjectivity in the sense that it says that there's no like universal truth. But instead of saying, I create my truth, you create your truth, it says we create our truth or they create their truth. So it sort of socializes that I into a we or a they. And the basic insight with cultural relativism is like, well, if you look historically, you're going to find that there's been radical variation on the values that any given culture, to the extent we can sort of isolate a culture and say this is a culture, has had over time. So, for example, so we can take it through time, like chronologically and say it's changed over time. We also can take it through space on a horizontal plane and like just look around. There's lots of different kinds of values that are out there. In some places, women have to be completely covered. In other places, they don't. In some places, children are are raised in sort of very, very, very strict, carefully regimented environments. In other places, they're allowed to roam free. In some places, the death penalty is sort of widely accepted. In other places, it's radically condemned. Some cultures in the past practiced human sacrifice. We might say a little polemical, but I think totally fair to say we practice our own kind of human sacrifice here with the abortion industry. But the point is with this idea is like, well, look, it just changes. So each society is going to have its own values, and that's just the way it is. Okay, and then the correspondence or objective conception of truth is going to say, well, look, independent of what anybody might say they think is useful, or independent of what anybody thinks is true individually or socially in time and space, there is a truth of the matter. There is a universal objective truth that's true whether we apprehend it or don't apprehend it. It's true whether we live according to it or don't live according to it. It's there in the same way that we might say sort of the universe is there whether or not we choose to believe in it or not. Okay, so just a little preview. This is where St. John Paul II is going to argue that we need to be. This is what he's going to argue that we need to plug into this epistemological level in order for authentic democracy to exist. Before we get to there, let's say, well, what's wrong with pragmatism and subjectivism or cultural relativism, especially pragmatism? Because, there's whole theories of democracy based upon this idea that democracy it's just about competing preferences. And the only way that we can make that work is to say, well, everybody let's just find the agreement that's most useful for everyone. Well, there's two basic problems here. One is that insofar as it tries to sidestep the question of truth and focus on what's useful, we have kind of like a conceptual conundrum. Like, okay, well, useful is not an independent concept, right? I can't say something is useful and you know what that means independently. Because what's the next question? Useful for what? It's like saying, oh, I have a tool. Like, oh, a tool. A tool for what? Right? So usefulness is always in relationship to some kind of goal, right? If you don't have a goal, then you can't even define what usefulness is. The problem with pragmatism at the sort of conceptual level is it says, what is the goal? The goal itself is usefulness. So usefulness is useful for what? Usefulness. Utility is useful for what? Greater utility. So the purpose of usefulness is to be useful. In other words, it's kind of a classic example of what's called a circular argument. It contains within the premises and the conclusion are ultimately the same thing in a vicious circle. So it doesn't really tell you anything. So what ultimately happens in pragmatic societies is what's useful just gets substituted with what most people want, which is we're just back to majoritarian domination. It's like what most people say is the case is the case. If you don't like it, too bad, you lost. Majoritarian domination. Connected to that, the other problem with pragmatism is that democracy may or may not be useful, right? Depending on who the pragmatists are, or who the most powerful are. I mean, we just went through with this. Again, I don't want to get too polemical here, but think of the whole COVID period we just went through. There were some people who are still arguing in some way or another, like voting is dangerous to democracy. You heard that? I've heard it. Voting is dangerous to democracy. We have to be careful about the voting because it might undermine democracy. So you're like, what in the world is that? What are you talking about? It's kind of a pragmatic, like sometimes democracy is good, sometimes it's bad. It depends on whether or not it's useful to some goal, a goal reduced to like what most people want. And if you're in a society that's being ruled by fear, different kinds of fear, then what most people want is like no democracy. So pragmatism is not going to work for authentic democracy. How about subjectivism or cultural relativism? Two problems with that. One is that it's called performatively self-contradictory. What performative self-contradiction is like, so if I tell you, for example, I am a biological orphan, like I can say those words to you, I'm a biological orphan, but the condition means like I have no mother and father at all. I didn't come from a mother and father. Now this is sort of mixing logic with metaphysics, but it's okay. The idea is like, in order for me to say I'm a biological orphan, I have to be contradicting myself, right? Because the condition for the possibility of me telling you I'm a biological orphan is in fact that I'm not a biological orphan. Well, it's the same kind of thing with subjectivism, cultural relativism. And like, if I say to you, all truths are equally arbitrary at the subjective or the cultural level, there's no such thing as objective truth. What I'm telling you is that it's objectively true that there are no objective truths. So I'm canceling out at that logical level what I'm claiming with my mouth. So we can say whatever. The question is it internally coherent? Neither one of these is internally coherent. In fact, they would have to, according to their own internal logic, a subjectivist or cultural relativist would have to say that cultures that do believe in objective values are wrong, right? They'd have to violate their own tenets. The other issue here is more radical. It's like, all right, so you're telling me, if you're a cultural relativist, you're telling me that like the society, the political makeup of North Korea nowadays, just total repression, total ruling by fear, right? You can be taken away in the middle of the night and disappeared. And it's happening frequently. Like it's just as good or just as bad, or like you take away good and bad as say in the United States. In a part of the United States that has a very functioning, healthy democracy. Like, there's just no difference between them. A society that practices human sacrifice is just as good as a society that cares about the poor and the vulnerable, right? So what both these are ultimately doing, what unites them, is a form of nihilism. So even if they look good on the surface, both of them are ultimately saying, or the implications of both theories of truth, are saying that there is no truth to the matter, which means that if there's no truth here, well, then there's going to be no truth here and also no truth here. So we're back to this kind of God is dead framework. Fortunately, we also have this correspondence or objective conception of truth. And this is the conception of truth that St. John Paul II is going to say is the right one. So from a correspondence or objective conception of truth, we'll just zero in exactly on like today's topic. We're saying that democracy is somehow, now of course there's lots of steps to establish this, is somehow it's good, and that good is somehow embedded in reality itself. So in a correspondence view of truth, we're not really knowing we're more like recognizing, we're more like discovering more than knowing itself. We're finding out truths that are somehow already embedded in reality. And so that means that anything that we claim here, as long as we can, justify it, make a good argument for it, is in fact real. So it protects us from nihilism. Another crucial, let's say, benefit of the correspondence and objective conception of truth is that what this means is that we all live in the same epistemic universe. If you're in pragmatism land or subjectivity or cultural relativism land, well, it sounds like Pleasure Island, like you get to just make it up as you go. You're actually radically isolated from every single other person. You are in a world literally of your own making, to the extent that that's even possible, which it's not, because we rely on language, which is already socialized. But that's sort of the idea. Okay, so you're in a world of your own making. That means that there's no shared consensus. Consensus is literally impossible at the level of like rational consensus. Oh, we actually objectively agree with each other. There's overlapping interests maybe, but not consensus. In order to have true consensus, in order to actually agree, in order to have dialogue, in order to have an argument with another person, to be mutually intelligible, we have to live in the same epistemic universe. We have to take it at least as a postulate that the truth is not only knowable, but universally knowable among all humans in time and space. So for that reason, St. John Paul II is saying that we need ultimate truth, right? If we don't have ultimate truth, then there's no way that we're going to be able to do anything about this idea of democracy. It will all crumble. Now, I'm getting close to the end here, and we'll start looking at some questions. But there's two more things that we need to get on the table. Remember that St. John Paul II says it's not just about ultimate truth, it's also about a correct view of the human being, right? A correct understanding of the human person. So let me just erase a little bit here. We're getting close. We're getting close. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at this anthropological level. Okay, so we established that we need ultimate truth here. And he says we also need a correct understanding of the anthropology. Well, what are those two correct understandings? One of them, this isn't in the quote itself, but it's deep within his thought, and this is totally representative of the Catholic intellectual tradition, would be human dignity. And the other, very closely related to dignity, but there's some important distinction as well, is human equality. Okay. Now, why would these be necessary preconditions for democracy? Well, let's think of it this way. Ask yourself this question. Why should every person who has the capacity to vote, meaning everyone with the mental wherewithal to do so, be given the power to vote? Why should we do that? Why not limit it only to men, or limit it to women, or to those who look a certain way, a particular ethnicity, or those who have property, or those who have businesses, or those who are paying the most in taxes, or those who have the most educational credentials, went to the right schools, or those with the greatest social media followers, or whatever other metric we want to put in there to divide up humanity and say, well, these are the people that actually should have the right to vote. Of the subset of all rational people, let's just restrict it to this group over here. Well, the answer to that question, the reason that we don't restrict it in that way is because we have, or they should have, implicitly do have, whether people admit it or not, a conception that everybody is worth the same. So already pointing to the idea of human equality. We say all human beings have dignity insofar as they are human. So given that they have the capacity to vote, right? So we'll just, again, we're cutting this off, like you're 18 years of age, you're already sufficiently mentally developed to be able to take upon this responsibility. No other limitation, right? In general. Now, again, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, what about, felons can't vote? We could have that conversation later, but just in a general sense, you have a right to vote because you are a human being, and that exists as a real moral principle because we affirm human dignity. Now, on top of that, we could say, well, okay, it's one thing to say all human beings should have the right to vote, within their respective countries, all citizens. But why should each vote count equally? Well, it's because built into the idea of human dignity is also the idea that not only do we have sort of a baseline dignity, but then there's like different metaphysical, ontological dignity stacked on top of that. It's like, no, that baseline dignity is actually equal. And insofar as regards voting and moral regard in general, it's radically equal. So the reason not only every adult can vote, but each vote counts the same is because of human equality. So what St. John Paul II would say is that if we take away ultimate truth and we take away human equality and human dignity, which can happen and does happen, as historical precedents for this, could happen to our own country or any other democracy right now. If we do that, what's going to happen? All of this is going to get canceled. It's going to collapse, and that will include democracy itself. So I'm going to turn now to questions, but what I want to sort of lay out as a kind of a summary point is that the condition for the possibility for democracy lies in not only the sort of map that I tried to explain, but lies in the particular, let's say Catholic, we could extract a little more, say biblical and Christian understanding of truth and the human person. So in that sense, we can already say that democracy, if we truly care about democracy, has no greater friend than the Catholic intellectual tradition. All right, we have some time for questions. Let's go to them. All right, we have a question here from, I want to thank Robbie Ocampo, is our community manager. He's been pulling your questions off the Institute platform and also the live stream. So I'm reading those now. We have a question from Michael, a member of the Institute. He asks, it seems that here in the USA, at least at the federal level, the two major parties keep drifting further and further away from the church's teaching and nominate increasingly morally questionable candidates. How can Catholics respond to and seek to change that? Day 2 and 3. Day 2 and 3 of the seminar. Now, I know that sounds like a cheat, but what we need to do and what we're going to start doing tomorrow is we'll move. So we have this foundation of human dignity and human equality and ultimate truth. And then on top of that, we're going to see how different moral theories will fit or not fit on those two foundational, those three foundational principles. And what we'll ultimately point to is the common good. So the common good is going to be the comprehensive moral theory, grows out of the Catholic intellectual tradition, expression of the Catholic social thought tradition, that will provide us the tools that we need in order to make these sort of concrete decisions about what's good to pursue, what's not good to pursue, including prudential decisions about who's best to vote for and not best to vote for. And of course, we're not going to talk about particular candidates, but just sort of general guidelines. So we will get to that. All right. Charles from YouTube livestream asks, how do we convince people, particularly politicians, how to recognize and promote objective truth? I think, there's a few ways to look at that. One of them, in just sort of a very practical sense, is we need a better class of journalists, and I think we're starting to get that. But it's certainly, let's say, I think it's fair to say that our journalistic class has not been the most truth-seeking, or as truth-seeking as we might need them to be in order for this democracy to be functioning properly. And one of the sort of the most important truth-seeking activities of a journalist is not only saying like, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that, what's your position, or what are you going to do under these sets of circumstances, but just this powerful question like, well, why? Like, okay, candidate X, like you have said that you think that it's really important to care for the poor. Why? And if the candidate says, well, because we have an obligation to care for those who can't care for themselves, then a fundamental question, well, what defines who can't care for themselves? Like, who's in that category, who's not in that category? And right, so you can probably see where I'm going with this. You begin down to the question of abortion, right? Because the question of like the value of human life. Our politics, and maybe this is just part of the game. I think you probably have to say it. It is part of the game. Like, it's going to be just riddled with inconsistencies. It's going to be riddled with people who, for various reasons, some of them understandable, some of them, just completely attributable to like vanity and the desire for power, are stitching together positions and coalitions that don't have some kind of underlying consistency to them. But that doesn't mean we can't try, right? That doesn't mean we can't try to ask our politicians, our people who are seeking office, to go down into the basement with us and say, like, why? Like, how you say you value human freedom and you value human equality. How are those things related to each other? So I think that would be sort of a practical response to that question, is we need to be asking those questions of our political candidates themselves. Okay, Tom, a member of the Word on Fire Institute, asks, does Catholic social teaching have anything to say about voting for a third party that has zero chance of winning? And two, I knew I was going to get these questions. And two, whose candidate are qualified? And two, whose candidates are unqualified to be president? Day 2 and especially day 3. But as like a preview, it provides, the Catholic social thought tradition is going to carve out a big space for individual conscience. Now, don't get nervous. I'm not going to say that, conscience justifies absolutely everything, because it does not. And I know how frequently conscience is used, especially within Catholic circles, to justify things that are intrinsically evil. So the church has a coherent view of conscience that does not justify intrinsic evil. I know it's all like it's abused all the time. I get that. But the actual concept itself rules that out, but also does leave this space for answering these questions in what we could say is like a prudential manner. So we will get to that. James, a member of the Word on Fire Institute, asks, is it fair to say that the larger those circles get, the closer we can get to being driven by perspectives of God? And conversely, the smaller the scope of the circle, the more secular our viewpoint inherently becomes. I think that's yes. I think the answer to that question is yes, and here's why. So, when we're focused just on the particularity, when we're focused on these smaller circles, right, it's very easy to kind of get lost in them and to live our entire life at the level of politics. I mean, God knows that like politics consumes our life nowadays, right? It dominates everything that we do. Like it poisons our friendships, it poisons our economy, it poisons our very families, right? So politics is everywhere. So when we stay in these circles, right, it begins to eat up all of our attention, and that's why it's so important. It's so important, and this is at the heart of what we're trying to do at the Word on Fire Institute. It's like pause and say, does this actually make sense? It's understandable that we get consumed with our day-to-day lives. It's understandable that we have a kind of affinity to living in the here and now. But that's not where ultimately we're going to find peace. It's not where we're going to find justice. It's not where we're going to find a peaceful society. So we have to force ourselves as a kind of academic, intellectual exercise to go to these deeper levels. And there's really the way that you do that is going back to your best 5-year-old version of yourself and just be like, well, why? Interesting. Well, what about that? Why? If you're in conversation with somebody that you're debating with, family, friend, whatever, acquaintance, just be like, and ask sincerely. Don't ask like, it's not like a manipulative why, but like, well, why? Why did you say that? Why do you have that view of the human person? Where do you think, like, if you believe in human equality, like, why in the world is it possible to have human equality if you say that you don't believe in God? These kinds of things. So the power of why will get us down to those deeper levels, and will at least open the space for those questions to be asked, even if we can't, ever hope in this life that we'll ever have complete agreement. Okay. Don, a Word on Fire member asks, do we need a transformation of heart to affect cultural change? Yes, we do need a transformation of heart. And one of the reasons why is, but this is like forever and ongoing. It's not like, oh, at this point in history, we had a transformation of heart and things were great, and then we lost the transformation of heart and then things went bad. Some historical periods are morally better than others in some respects. We can definitely say that. But in general, the transformation of heart is part of the problem of wrapped with the problem of sin itself, which is going to be around. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. And it has to be factored into our understanding of politics. One of the reasons why an ongoing transformation of heart is so important is because we're not going to see right. We're not going to see properly if our heart is in the right place. And not only not going to see right, we're not going to act right. So the whole Catholic anthropology, so again, at this anthropological level, it does not divorce the mind from the heart. Catholic anthropology will always see us as a unity. We're a unity of body and soul. We're a unity of mind and heart. We're a unity of will and intellect. So we make distinctions within ourselves, but we ultimately always have to see these unities as together, which is ultimately embedded in the greatest unity of all, the unity of God. And so if we're not, the Catholic anthropological understanding is, if we don't have the right desires, if we're not oriented in the right way, we're actually not going to see things as they are. So for example, I might have as an intellectual thought in my head, all human beings are equal. But if I don't have a genuine love for humanity, right, in the proper sense, I don't mean in some like generic secular sense, I'm like we're commanded to love our neighbor. Like, I will have that thought, but I won't act on it. And I actually won't even see properly the instances in which I'm not acting according to the own principle that I think I have. I'll constantly be making exceptions for myself. So yes, we do need the general conversion of heart, absolutely. But I would say that we always need it internally as well for ourselves to have any hope, not only of thinking clearly, but of acting correctly. James R. on the platform asks, given the scope of these ideas presented today, democracy, theology, ontology, anthropology, epistemology, etc., what then is the role and responsibility of Catholic Christians within a democratic society? The role is like everything, okay? But one thing that I really emphasize is like we should learn this stuff, and I want to just be clear, like what I'm teaching here, I'm not really teaching. I'm lifting up I'm opening the doors to the Catholic intellectual tradition, and you're free to like stop by at any time and just browse it because it's there. I'm the tour guide to the Catholic intellectual tradition. So we should know this stuff, right? This stuff is very, very, very useful. And insofar as we know it, we can engage in conversation in a coherent and compelling way with people who are willing to talk to us about these kinds of things. So that's one thing. The other thing that's just important, I would actually say is more important, and this comes out in a lot of the stuff that I say, is like, be a happy, normal person. Be a witness, not to, I don't know, like, Christian joy is very important, but oftentimes it gets too sweet and syrupy and doesn't even, it becomes artificial. Joy, I think a better way of conceiving it, and it's just sort of a basis, is like peace. Be a person who's at peace with yourself, with those around you, and with the world, even when you're like resisting, even when you're fighting fighting the good fight, because that kind of peace, especially nowadays, is so rare that it has a kind of magnetic power to it. And I think we're witnessing that in real time right now, like as everything sort of decays around us. The people who are grounded in the Lord, right, all of a sudden are visible as like all the fallen bodies everywhere on a battlefield, right? And there's these people walking around like, I'm okay. I'm wounded, yeah, but I'm okay. So be the okay people. And that takes practice. Go to one more question here. Question from Irmela on the Word on Fire Institute. How would one counter the common argument voting should be based on intelligence? Hidden beneath this is a value system that human value is also based on intelligence. Intelligence is important. Our country has this is part of the sort of the old racist laws of our country, is that like, we're going to create an intelligence test in order to go against human dignity and to say, well, this group but not this group. And so it's dangerous to use that as a standard, very dangerous. But of course, intelligence is important. But you know what? Intelligence doesn't give us dignity. And intelligence can be used for good. It can be used for evil. So yes, value intelligence. It is a gift from God that we can develop or not develop, but we don't come up with ourselves. We should use it for the good, but basing a dignity on it, a non-starter. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to end with this. I hope that those of you who are, I want to thank you, all of you who are watching on the Word on Fire Institute platform. We'll be back day 2 and day 3, talking about some of the things we've already laid out. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, I really invite you to take the opportunity to go right now to institute.wordonfire.org. It's institute.wordonfire.org, and to sign up for a free 30-day trial to the Institute platform. Again, it's free for 30 days. There's no risk to signing up. When you do sign up, you'll get a free copy of this book here, Evangelization and Ideology. A lot of the concepts we've been working with today and we'll be continuing to work with are laid out in great detail here. And you'll also get a copy of our latest Word on Fire Institute journal on democracy itself, in addition to getting access to, I think we have like 54 courses now. We have a dozen interactive communities, apologetics for evangelists, theology for evangelists. We have a men's community. We have a women's community. We have a Catholic educators community. All of that is on the Institute platform. What we're seeking to do with it is to build a digital city of God, a community of communities, a place to be and become Catholic with and for others. And we want you to be a part of it. So please, those of you who have not signed up yet, go right now to institute.wordonfire.org and get that free trial subscription. Thank you all, and I'll see you again tomorrow. God bless you.